deep inside, there's a huge part of me that's gone.
The horror is once you get out, trying to get back what you'd lost.
When you're on that side of the bars and there's no way, there's no hope, there's no crack, you give up.
Took away a big portion of my life, took away my life with my children.
I mean, what happened to the word investigation?
Helpless, fear, anger, and revenge, and wanting people to be held accountable for what had happened to me.
And why? Why did you do it? What possessed you to play God?
I knew my life was over right there.
Having my family taken away, everything taken away from me.
I had my life stolen away for 25.5 years for a crime I didn't commit. You can't get that time back.
Hi, I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lozon.
And this is Real Life Wrongs.
Episode 5, I'll Trade You. Highlight case, Maria Shepard. Guess, Allison Redlich and Maria Shepard.
It's winter 1991. Your 3-year-old stepdaughter, Cassandra, is sick. She's constantly vomiting, and nothing you do seems to help. You bring her to your family doctor, who suggests she may have gastroenteritis. You bring her home and expect things will get better. Within a few days, her condition worsens, and on February 8th, you take her to the hospital. They run some tests and admit her. At this time, you inform them of a family history of seizures, but the medical team give no indication of concern in that area. When she's discharged a month later, on March 11th, she's still sick. You have no more answers than when you went in, and you're told to do follow-up visits with various doctors. But within days of her returning home, the vomiting returns with a vengeance. She's so weak, she can't hold her own head up or food down. You're told to continue using Gravol and try changing the time and amount you feed her. You are at a complete loss. On April 9th, her eyes roll back, her body stiffens, and she begins to shake. It stops and starts so fast. You've never seen anything like this. Later that afternoon, when your husband is home from work, it happens again, but it's more extreme, and you're able to recognize this as a possible seizure. Suddenly, she stops breathing. Your neighbor who happens to be visiting and fortunately knows CPR revives Cassandra, and you've already called the paramedics. They bring her to the hospital with the recommendation that she be transferred to Toronto Sick Children's Hospital as soon as possible. In emergency at the local hospital, you see as Cassandra begins to twitch again, an indication of another seizure coming on. You alert the hospital staff, but they don't share in your concern. As you suspected, she does have a seizure, and it's worse than any she's had yet. Her eyes roll back, she squeals loudly, her back arches, and she seizes violently. The nurses come rushing. They intubate her and start an IV drip. At this time, the medical staff make the decision to transfer her to Sick Kids. When you arrive there, the doctor speaks with you, your husband, and Cassandra's birth mother who has arrived. The doctor tells you that her CT scan shows signs of a traumatic head injury. The scans he's referring to are the ones the neurologist had looked at a few weeks ago when she was admitted, when there were no concerns. So what's changed? The doctor asks if any of you know how the head injury occurred. You all confirm that you don't know and that no one has harmed her in any way. He tells you her brain is swollen and that she's in grave danger. But he also says her condition has stabilized, so you should go home and get some rest. 2 hours later, the phone rings, and you're told she is brain dead. The only thing keeping Cassandra alive are support machines. 2 days after you rushed her to Sick Kids, Cassandra is taken off of life support.
So you proceed with funeral arrangements and bury your child. What happens next is where things really start to go off the rails. The police launch an investigation into Cassandra's death, and they believe You had something to do with it. They interview both you and your husband, and they try to get you to turn on each other. This doesn't work, and seeing as you were Cassandra's primary caregiver, they turn the focus of the investigation solely on you. During your next interview, the officers make it clear that if you don't give them the information that they want, the next day the headlines will read, "Stepmother kills stepdaughter," and your other children will be taken away from you. You're subjected to a polygraph test that goes on for hours. By the end of it, you're exhausted, both mentally and physically. You've spent hours listening to everyone telling you that they don't believe you because they have the word of the leading pediatric forensic pathologist, and he says that Cassandra died as a result of blows to the head. There's even a watch-shaped mark under her scalp. And according to him, it's a perfect match to your watch. With exhaustion taking over, grieving the loss of your stepdaughter, and desperate to get back to your family, you feel like you have no choice but to tell them what they want to hear.
This is the story of Maria Shepard, a woman who was offered a plea deal and took it. She pled guilty to shaking her stepdaughter, causing death. Today on Real Life Wrongs, we're explaining plea deals and how sometimes an accused feels they have no choice but to confess to a crime they didn't commit. Okay, Kelly, what is a plea deal?
So I know this is where I normally give you the legal or the technical definition of something, but I'm having a lot of troubles doing this today because there's actually no definition for plea deal in the criminal code. And I always find it interesting that something we rely on so heavily and use so often isn't clearly defined.
Right. So even if there isn't a legal definition, how would you explain how a plea deal comes to pass?
Well, basically, there's a crime, or at least what's thought to be a crime, and the prosecutor and the defense talk about the evidence and what they think an acceptable outcome would be. And then based on these conversations, they come to an agreement about the charges and a fitting sentence. So then the defense counsel has to present the offer to their client, the accused. And if the accused agrees to the deal, there won't be a trial.
So there was an attempt at defining a plea deal in a journal article in 1979 in Criminal Law Quarterly called Plea Negotiations, defining a plea deal as a proceeding whereby competent and informed counsel openly discuss the evidence in a criminal prosecution with a view to achieving a disposition which will result in the reasonable advancement of the administration of justice. Does that sound about right?
I don't know about you, but I find the definition problematic because, well, it's filled with a bunch of assumptions.
Like, to start with, the competent and informed counsel part?
For one thing, yes. And it also assumes that the goal of the deal is the advancement of the administration of justice. And while this may be the goal in theory, cases of wrongful conviction make me question whether there's more pressing goals like closing a case or getting a win when some people are made to feel like they have no other option, like they have to take the deal.
So because they're saving everyone the time and expense of a trial, the accused will receive some kind of benefit in exchange for their guilty plea. So what kind of benefits would we be talking about?
Well, there's 3 different ways that the accused can benefit from a plea deal. So they could face fewer or lesser charges. They may receive a shorter or lesser sentence. And then there's what we call fact bargaining. And this is where the Crown will agree not to present certain facts that could be interpreted as aggravating factors.
Aggravating factors. Do you want to explain that?
So I mean, it could be if there's, if you have a history of drug use and somehow that could be brought in as a potential charge, because let's be honest, the police tend to overcharge. And it's usually because when you get to the plea process, you can drop a whole bunch of the charges. So, if there's some kind of drug related charge that they can add, the Crown will say, you know what, I'll drop these because that will look like an aggravating factor. Like it's making the main crime look worse than it actually is.
Right. So fact bargaining. Okay. All of that sounds very beneficial. Lesser charges, lesser sentence. Let's make a deal. But that's just the good news. Before we get to the bad news, it's no surprise that overall, people plead guilty to avoid receiving what they think will be a harsher punishment if they believe they will be found guilty at trial.
Yeah. I have to say yes to all of that. I mean, let's look at the case of Richard Brandt as an example. He was accused of killing his 9-week-old son. And after a very questionable investigation, he was charged with manslaughter. And Richard knew that he hadn't killed his son, but he also knew that he would be facing the Crown's star forensic expert. And it was clear to him there was a really good chance that he would be found guilty based on the expert's testimony. And if he was, he would likely be facing a 15-year sentence. But lucky for Richard, he was given a choice. He could either go to trial or he could plead guilty to aggravated assault and only spend 6 to 9 months in jail. So Richard's lawyer urged him to take the deal, which he did.
Well, this seems like an impossible choice. Spend 15 years in prison if you can't convince 12 strangers that you didn't kill your son. Or tell everyone you did something horrible, even though you didn't do it, to save yourself 14 and a half years in prison.
Yeah, and what made it even tougher for him is that at the time, his girlfriend was expecting their second child, and he was afraid that that child would be taken away from them if he was convicted of manslaughter. Turns out he was telling the truth all along. He hadn't murdered his son. And what they found out later was that his son had died from complications of pneumonia. But because he'd pled guilty, no one looked at the underlying health issues for many years.
And during this time, everyone thought he was a monster who had killed his newborn baby.
Yeah. And this is what makes plea bargaining so problematic. You never get the chance to tell your side of the story.
Right. So once I take the deal, that's it. I'm guilty because, well, I said I am. But here I'm thinking I'm in a better position with these lesser charges or this lesser sentence. But that's far from the reality. So, Kelly, why don't I feel better about this?
Because you're going to jail and you know you don't deserve to be there. Everybody has the right to be presumed innocent and to have the benefit of a trial. But we end up punishing people who decide to engage those rights. Reality is, courts are clogged and we want to resolve cases quickly. So what happens is we end up encouraging people to plead guilty. And to do that, we reward them with more lenient sentences.
So if we're rewarding people for taking a deal, it kind of feels like we're punishing people for exercising their right to go to trial. Like, in fact, there's a name for this. It's called the trial penalty.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And the trial penalty is the difference between the sentence you would get if you were convicted at trial and the sentence you're being offered with the plea deal. And usually it's a pretty big difference. And generally speaking, the bigger the discount, the more likely somebody is going to plead guilty.
I'm a sucker for a sale. So
aren't we
prime
all?
Suspect here.
Right? Like, aren't we all? And I mean, it gets really tricky because there's a really fine line between offering enough of a discount to get people to forego going to trial and, just pleading guilty. But you don't want to make it so enticing that even innocent people are going to take the deal.
Yeah, there's the old saying, it's not what you spend, it's what you save. But I somehow think this doesn't apply here. So, what's the magic number then when we talk about this discount?
Well, there doesn't really seem to be a number that we can all agree on, right? If you look at England, they generally work with a discount of about 30% for guilty plea. So if you go to trial and a guilty verdict would get you 10 years, you'd be offered a plea deal where you'd save yourself 3 years.
Only 7 years. What a deal.
Well, it's 3 years not in prison, so I guess it is a deal. But let's compare that to how the US works the trial penalty. They're working with somewhere between 100 to 500% trial penalty. So what this means is that if you go to trial and you're facing a sentence of 20 years if you're convicted, the sentence you would be given if you skip trial and plead guilty would be somewhere in the range of 4 to 10 years. So, you look at this and it's really hard not to say that the trial penalty in these cases is coercive.
Yeah. Here in Canada, the judges try to avoid putting any kind of number on the discount. Instead, the discount is left to the judge's discretion, who looks at things on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. And, I'm honestly not sure how I feel about this. Because on the one hand, we're allowing for individual circumstances to be taken into consideration. But at the same time, there's no consistency, right? Like we can't say this is what you should be facing.
I love that trial is beginning to sound like a trap. So is taking a plea deal the best option then?
Well, I think it's hard not to jump at a good deal, but we have to remember that when you take a deal, while you may get some immediate rewards like getting to go home sooner or having other charges dropped, there's more long-term things that you have to keep in mind.
Because how many of us actually know what's going to happen as a result of taking a deal? How many of us understand how we'd be altering our lives forever? To plead guilty to a crime you didn't commit because it sounds so much better than being locked up may be a too good to be true scenario. For example, once you plead guilty, you can't appeal your conviction. You also have to consider that you won't get the chance to tell your side of the story or face your accuser or question witnesses. Once you plead guilty, that's the end of the road for you.
Yeah. And, I think all this is to say that, like with any other deal, you have to be careful to read the fine print. And I think this is a great time to turn to our interview with our expert, Allison Redlich. So Dr. Redlich is an experimental psychologist and an expert on guilty pleas, interrogations, and confessions. And her research focuses on whether legal decision-making is knowing, intelligent, and voluntary. And she studies wrongful convictions with a particular focus on false confessions and false guilty pleas. And I know that when we spoke with her, my eyes were opened wide when she was talking about her research in the area of plea deals. I always knew the trial penalty was a thing, but something I wasn't aware of were all the collateral consequences that come with taking a plea deal. So let's turn to Allison and let her explain what this means.
The law does not require anybody to inform the defendant of what are called collateral consequences, such as public housing and your ineligibility to apply for student governmental loans or any of those kinds of things, licenses. Those are what are called collateral consequences. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there is some some people who think that there's a perverse incentive for defense counsel, for attorneys, not to inform their clients of these collateral consequences, because there are thousands of collateral consequences. I think there's been some efforts to catalog them. I think the last time I looked, there was more than 47,000 collateral consequences. And what can happen is if a defense attorney provides inaccurate information to a defendant, the defendant then has a claim for ineffective assistance of counsel and can try and overturn their plea conviction, which maybe if they're innocent, that's a good thing. But because there are so many different collateral consequences, it's almost impossible for defense attorneys to be able to necessarily provide accurate information. It's very individual dependent. And so there's this incentive not to inform clients of their risk of collateral consequences. The method of telling defendants is not always clear. It may be this verbal interaction in this minutes-long exchange. It may be presumed to be, I think your defense attorney covered that already. And, it's just a presumption that it took place. There's a presumption that the defendant understood the direct consequences. So there's a lot of problems with guilty pleas, which make up about 95 to 97% of convictions in the United States. And guilty pleas are increasing throughout the world. And we're starting to see more and more countries adopting guilty pleas. They did not have them before, and more countries resolving the majority of their cases using guilty pleas like the United States.
You mentioned something like 47,000 collateral consequences. How is it even possible, or is it even possible for someone to receive that information? I mean, how do we give them time to consider their options? I mean, you're handing them a tome of, and most people aren't going to understand a lot of that. What's possible here?
If we wanted to, if the legislature or the Supreme Court wanted to make that mandatory, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think I'm sure there's very likely to be collateral consequences that are more important to know than others of those 47,000. It largely depends on your defense attorney. And one of the things that we know from wrongful convictions and the criminal justice system, at least here in the United States more generally, is that we have a very underfunded public defender system. In fact, not all jurisdictions have formal public defender offices. There's different ways of representing indigent clients, but I think it's about 85% of defendants in the United States are too poor to afford their own lawyers. And of course, it's a right that they have to be given a lawyer, but the quality of that representation can really vary. And it's not because these aren't well-meaning public defenders. It's just that they're overburdened. They have very high caseloads. So that's one mechanism in which defendants can get information about the consequences of pleading guilty and all of the information that they should be getting. And another way is through what's called a plea colloquy, which is really just kind of a very formal boilerplate process. And this is what happens when defendants go into court and they are ready to accept a plea. It's usually already negotiated. And it's really just kind of a formal process where the judge is asking the defendant a series of questions. So that's another way of potentially informing of clients. But these plea discussions or plea hearings in general, they tend to be about 10 minutes or less. They're very brief affairs and they're very incomplete. you asked me before if being informed of some of these collateral consequences, would that change somebody's decision? And that's a question I've always asked myself, because it is a dichotomous decision. It's either yes, I'm going to plead guilty, or no, I'm not. And I tend to think that the incentives that are in place for plea bargaining are so enticing and so appealing that I'm not always sure that being informed of certain things is going to change somebody's decision. I absolutely think it's extremely important to make an informed decision. If I were in that position, I would want to have all of the information at my fingertips, and Kelly, being a researcher, informed consent. It's just a part and parcel of what we do. It's so important. But that's not what we're seeing in defendant decision-making for pleas. And so when you say that it's guilty pleas, they must be made knowingly, voluntarily, intelligently and voluntarily, and with a factual basis of guilt. This is how the four components of how I define a valid guilty plea. I don't think that we are seeing informed decision-making. And I do think in some circumstances it would change the decision. In others, it might not change that bottom line decision, because the plea discount or the ability to leave jail that very day, they're just, hard to pass up, even if somebody is innocent. All of these constitutionally afforded rights that we have, like, one of my favorites is that the prosecution has to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not the case in guilty pleas. You're waiving all of those rights. So you go to trial, you have all of those rights intact. But at least in the States, 3 out of 4 defendants who go to trial are convicted. And your probability of being convicted at trial is high, and you are going to face more severe consequences. And that, I think, is at the heart of why most people plead guilty, regardless of guilt or innocence.
Here, if you confess to a crime, even if it's a false confession and you are innocent, you're done. Like, you have no recourse to appeal. You have no, you've sealed your own fate. You've sealed your own case. Is it the same with the plea deal, that once you plead guilty, there's very unlikely chance that your case is going to be reheard?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, if you look at the National Registry of Exonerations, about 20% of them are false guilty pleas. You take that 20% and you compare it to the 95, 97% of guilty pleas that we know, make up a convictions. And of course, you would like to think that most of them are guilty. And I hope that's true. Otherwise, the reverse is unimaginable. But that's a pretty big discrepancy, between 20% and 95%. And one of the reasons I think that we don't know about more false guilty pleas than these 20% that we've identified is because of this, is that they're very hard to overturn. Once somebody pleads guilty, there's multiple things in place. You have to demonstrate that it was either not knowing or voluntary intelligent, or perhaps you could argue actual innocence. I think it very much depends on the judge and the prosecutors in your case. But there's also a lot less motivation, especially, again, in the lower level crimes. If you're in prison, you've got a plea bargain, you've served your time, and you're out, and you still want to clear your name, I think it would be almost impossible to do it on your own. You would need the resources of attorneys and those kinds of things. And there's just a lot less motivation for the person, him or herself, who's wrongly convicted, to go through that trouble to exonerate themselves. There's fewer people, I think, who are willing to to help you, and maybe rightly so. Maybe they should be expending their resources on people who are in prison still waiting to be exonerated. But there's a lot of reasons, I think, in place why we don't know about more false guilty pleas.
So our conversation with Allison was really eye-opening because one of the main conditions of entering a guilty plea is that you're doing it knowingly, willfully, and voluntarily. But when you learn about all of the collateral consequences and the fact that they're often not disclosed to the person who's agreeing to the deal, I honestly have to question how they can make a knowing, willful, or voluntary decision about their future.
Yeah, because once you've admitted guilt, that's it. It's near impossible to retract. Everything we've talked about so far involves pleading guilty to more serious charges, but it's interesting that plea deals happen really in a myriad of cases.
Absolutely. And, I always thought that there would be more pressure or more incentive to plead guilty when you're charged with a more serious offense. But truth is, there's actually more pressure or incentive to plead guilty when you're charged with lesser offenses.
Yeah, I thought there would be more pressure put on someone to plead guilty in something like a murder case, rather than a smaller crime like shoplifting, break and enter, or loitering. But that's actually not the case.
No, it's not. And it's often those kinds of smaller offenses where people are likely to plead guilty.
So why would people accused of lesser charges feel more pressure to take a deal?
Because it's so much easier for them to just plead guilty than to drag things on and go to trial. In a lot of cases, they can't make bail, so they'd end up sitting in jail until their court date anyways, right? And often for lesser offenses, a plea bargain will offer you the possibility of going home if you just plead guilty.
Right. This would obviously be attractive to anyone. Like no more jail time, no more missed days at work, no more having to arrange for childcare or transportation. Like it just sounds so much better.
Yeah. And in these cases, the plea deal is just a way for them to end the proceedings and to move on with their life. Like Malcolm Feely famously said in the 70s, the process is the punishment. And going to trial is more of a punishment for a lot of people than just paying your fine or serving your sentence on weekends.
Yeah, we use plea deals to resolve serious offenses and less serious offenses. Has this just become the way we solve problems? Or like the quick and dirty solution? Trials are just too expensive and time consuming to the point where our justice system is a drawn out episode of the game show. Let's make a deal.
Yeah, I mean, it really does seem that plea bargaining has become normalized in the justice system to the point that it's estimated that somewhere between 90 to 95% of cases are resolved with a deal.
That's almost all. So do prosecutors have to offer plea deals?
Well, they don't have to offer deals, but they're encouraged to because it's obviously a way to reduce the backlog in the courts and to keep the resources available for more serious cases that do end up going to trial.
Okay, let's get back to the real life wrong through Maria Shepard.
So Maria is someone that I'm fortunate enough to call a friend of mine. And we've gone to conferences together. And I have her as a speaker in my class because she so poignantly shares her experience of being wrongfully convicted. And beyond all this, she's turned it into such a positive. She's on the board of directors at Innocence Canada, and she has become a licensed paralegal, and she fights vehemently for her clients, and she ensures that, they're not subjected to the same questionable tactics that she was.
So let's hear from her, highlights from our interview as she walks us through her experience.
I can't help but wonder, looking at things in hindsight, that, maybe we weren't good enough. Maybe because, we were a single income family. Maybe because I was on welfare. Maybe because my husband was Black and I'm Asian. And it's, God forbid at the time, it was not a very well accepted situation. And so when the interim order came from the court that my husband was to have interim custody, I remember very clearly in the mall when we did the exchange, she was very, very bitter, the mom at the exchange where she was bringing Cassandra to my husband. And she had said that day that she was going to make our lives a living hell. I never thought in a million years that this is what it was going to be. We were a blended family. And back in those days, late 80s, even early 80s, going into the early 90s, having a mixed race family was frowned upon.
Yeah.
And my mother, who brought me up, never taught me to look at color. She never taught me to look at somebody's socioeconomic status to determine whether I want to have some kind of friendship or connection with somebody. My mother was a walking angel of this earth, and her grandson can attest to that. And she she welcomed Cassandra with such open arms as her first granddaughter, really. And I just feel like the odds were stacked against us from the very outset. But when my husband went to go to this lawyer initially to apply for custody, the first lawyer he saw, by the way, the first lawyer asked my husband, what's the nationality of Cassandra's mother, the biological mother, Scottish background. His words out of his mouth was, you don't have a chance in hell.
Huh.
He's white and you're black. There's no way the court will even consider you. So my husband initially, for a period of time, abandoned the idea and was very depressed for a long time. And so I went on a search and I said, we're going to find somebody that's going to see you beyond your color and see how much you love her. And we eventually did. So we retained George Schnall, who was a phenomenal family lawyer that stayed with us through everything. Even to this day, he still reaches out to us to say, how are you doing? But there's so much pain that goes behind realizing that your socioeconomic status, your nationality, your race, your ethnicity plays such a huge, it's such a detriment for you as a human being in the kind of society we were in, albeit we're not like that now. I think we're moving away from that. We're recognizing more of it, and I'm glad. But the story of Cassandra went well beyond the wrongful conviction. It will forever be with me that if there was any guilt or any guilt that I still feel in my heart, is that I wasn't smart enough or wise enough to know how I could have maybe moved things harder or pushed harder to save Cassandra. There was nothing. I was stupid. I was 21. I wish now in hindsight, being 52, I think maybe if I had known what a seizure looked like, then maybe I would have, been more knowledgeable and maybe more forceful at the hospital. But once again, being young, I had this over-reliance on the expertise of people that are supposed to help us when we're sick in a hospital. We're supposed to be protected by authorities that my parents raised me as block parents for the community. So I always had this underlying trust for the police. When I took the guilty plea, the first and foremost thing that was before me, that it was in front of me, was what is going to be the best decision that's going to keep my family together? I'm not going to lose my children. What's the shortest time? So when the Crown came forward with this 2 years less a day, 3 years probation, recommendation for early parole, the care was perfect for the moment. My emotions, where I was thinking, my frame of mind. I never stopped to think for a moment, though, of the domino effect for the rest of the lives of my children, how it will affect them and affect, their processes of trust, security, love. And so that's a guilt that I I feel bad for. However, it's sort of an angel on one shoulder, devil on the other shoulder. I did it to keep my family together, and that's exactly what I did. I have no regrets there.
Well, and you can only imagine what the repercussions would have been if you had gone to trial and, you had this expert evidence admitted against you, which tends to carry weight with a jury, and you had been convicted, right? Like in this sense, it's 2 years less a day that you're spending apart from your family, as opposed to potentially facing years away from the family. So, and you can only imagine what the repercussion of that may have been, right? So,
and we don't know what we don't know.
Exactly.
We just don't.
And I mean, it just seems you're between a rock and a hard place, and there's no good decision either way.
Well, like Jordan had mentioned earlier in the morning, when I was going to turn myself in for my sentence, I'll never forget it. We sat outside the porch of my mother's house because the kids were living with my parents. Couldn't be alone with them. So we were outside, and my husband was driving a white Taurus at the time. And I remember having Jordy on my lap. And I said, Mommy's got to go away for a while. And he said, what's a while, Mommy? And I said, well, I think it's going to be about 24 weeks. It's not too long. He says, okay, I just remember. And it didn't hit him yet. And he said, where are you going? And I said, they're sending me to a place where bad people go. And he said, why? I said, when you're older, we'll talk about it. Right now, you just need to know that Mommy's going to come home in 24 weeks. And then he was scurried away to the vehicle and placed in the back seat. And somehow or another, he managed to get out of like his booster, undo his belt. And as they were driving away, Jordan was up against the back windshield of the window, scraping at the window, just absolutely in tears and devastated. And the impact of that image, like, it lives with you forever, right? And so, those are the places where I feel guilty that I had to put them in that sense of pain in order to succeed and keep us together as a family unit. Because Smith was going, I don't know if you know, Professor Lozon, but Charles Smith and the Crown tried to add shaken baby syndrome after I pled guilty the first time. And then because of that, the judge struck the plea. And then I had to re-enter a plea after the Crown says we're not going to pursue shaken baby syndrome. So, I mean, it was just a fiasco. It was a fiasco, and
how to make a bad situation worse.
Absolutely.
It just seems there's no end to the malice.
Mm-hmm. So determined. Such a dogged prosecution. The tunnel vision was disgraceful. Nothing else. Nothing we said that they never investigated anything else.
Yeah.
And those are questions that will forever be with me.
Unbelievable.
But yeah, it was a journey, that's for sure. The morning of the acquittal was surreal. Well, leading up to it actually was surreal, a couple of days, because we were preparing for the press release and we were very specific about who was going to cover it. I met with the reporters, and then another reporter completely out of the blue goes and breaks the story before the people that were designated to do it. Nonetheless, my friends, we all stayed at the Sheraton the night before, my closest friends of almost 40 years now, to give me that support and love. And that meant a lot. But to get in front of the court, that was different. I was expecting a small media. I was get into the Court of Appeal. We went into a smaller room. I'd never seen what it looked like in there before, so it was very intimidating. I see a long stretch of bench where I see that there's going to be 3 justices that are going to sit there and render a decision, which could go either way still. They could have just said no. They could have decided last minute, we're not going to proceed with this. So I was a basket of nerves. Something happened and we were going to start, and the courtroom was shut down and we were shuffled to a different courtroom, which was bigger because apparently the crowd was getting larger and larger, and it was only standing room. I was shocked. And then I remember one of the most important moments for that day for me was that my defense lawyer, who pled me guilty, sat beside me on one side and sat next to, and I sat on the other side of me, was my appellate lawyer. That's rare. I felt very honored and very, very blessed to have them both there and know that they were working together to really try and get what was the truth out, right? I went numb from what I remember when Justice Watt was delivering his ruling. I don't even remember half of what he said. What I do remember are these words: that Charles Smith was the linchpin, and it was a powerful inducement for my guilty plea. And then everything, I remember there was a short break. And again, I'm just completely in a different headspace at this point. I remember running out of the room at one point and being in the hallway and feeling so nauseated. My stomach was in knots. I was actually terrified. I went in there with this mindset that I was happy. I was supposed to be acquitted that morning, but I was terrified at the same time. I was terrified because I didn't trust a system that breached me so long ago. So I didn't know whether or not something would change. But on the assurances of, James Lockyer, I felt a sense of relief and safety. I felt safe. And I'll forever be grateful to him for that. One of the most important things of that day, although I did not get a direct apology from the bench, was hearing Crown Counsel Howard Leibovich say that Cassandra deserved better, my family deserved better, and that I deserve better. I think probably of the whole day, aside from being acquitted, and as an advocate, it's still really hard to talk about because this is coming from a representative from the office that worked so hard to prosecute me. And it really meant a lot. And then I have, of course, all behind me are all my children. My boy, who was 5 when I got convicted, seeing the day that it all came to fruition, that everything that we had prayed and hoped for and said for so long was finally heard.
In Maria's mind, it was less damaging for her to falsely confess than having to keep fighting in court. After her confession, Maria's other children were taken away from her and placed into her parents' custody. Meanwhile, she was now tasked with finding a lawyer, but unfortunately for her, this lawyer did not mount a strong defense, and he advised her to take the plea deal to avoid the potential embarrassment of a trial.
When the preliminary trial started, Maria was up against the word of the leading child forensic pathologist. She was encouraged to take a plea deal because at the end of the preliminary hearing, she was remanded to trial on manslaughter charges. Things were looking hopeless for her, and feeling that she had no chance, she entered a false guilty plea to save what was left of her family, to receive a shorter sentence, and to be able to have touch visits with her children.
So her guilty plea was strategic, but also had its consequences. What an ordeal. Like, to hear Maria explain how and why she took the deal, it's just hard to argue with that choice. But again, it's what you don't know. Most of us don't know what we're agreeing to.
Yeah. And, when you consider that, I find the whole subject of plea deals to be so controversial. I mean, you're right. It's really hard not to agree with taking a good deal. But the whole principle behind it makes me question what direction our justice system is headed in. I mean, we're forcing people's hands. We're telling them to waive their rights and to plead guilty just to get the case over with. It seems like we're valuing expediency over accuracy and close cases over justice.
Yeah, and that it all comes down to you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what could happen in court. You don't know how a jury will perceive the evidence against you. You don't know how convincing your lawyer will be. But what you do know is that it could all be done and over with right now if you just agree to tell them what they want to hear. And again, as we talk about, we're all potential jury members, and any one of us could also be in a situation where we're given a deal. So to just be aware of, the consequences of that decision.
Yeah. Well, and, just to follow up on that, one thing that I think that a lot of us don't consider is that once you plead guilty, that's it. Your case is closed. You can't appeal the conviction because you've just admitted to the court that you did it. And this is a big problem. There's a lot of people who plead guilty and they do so thinking that the truth is going to come out, that they're going to be able to overturn their conviction. But the truth is, this rarely happens. Are there a lot of innocent people who plead guilty to crimes that they didn't commit? Probably. Will we ever know the extent of the problem? Probably not. What we do know comes from simulated studies where people are placed in a hypothetical situation and they're asked to make decisions that are similar to someone facing a plea deal. And those studies suggest that 20 to 25% of innocent people will plead guilty. But we also know that things like a bigger bargain and not knowing about collateral consequences can make it an even bigger percentage.
And we also know that more and more countries are relying on plea deals to close cases. So it seems we need to be more careful in using these to make sure that we don't convict innocent people. So what can we do?
I mean, I keep coming back to this, but I really think everybody in the justice system needs to be informed about the collateral consequences. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a judge, but I've been studying this field for a pretty long time, and this came as news to me. Like, I was actually blown away by this. And I think it's really tough for anyone to really be able to make an informed decision if they don't know all of the consequences that their decision could have. I mean, I get it. We can't spell all of them out for every defendant, but there should be some kind of blanket statement that tells them that by pleading guilty to what seems like a small offense could come back to haunt you in a bunch of unexpected ways down the road, right? And like with so many other things, there has to be some accountability for all of the actors in the system. I mean, otherwise, why not push everyone to take a good deal, right? So in the end, it all comes down to saving time and money. And if the criminal justice actors aren't facing any consequences for pushing a deal on anyone, why stop what we're doing?
Yeah, if an innocent person like Maria pleads guilty to a crime they didn't do, doesn't it end up costing us more?
Of course it does.
Yeah.
Of course it does. But I think this is where justice kind of becomes a game. It's all about cost-benefit analysis, deciding how much risk we're willing to take on.
That old expression, it's not what you spend, it's what you save. My mother always said, try on the jeans before you buy them. Sure enough, whenever I don't, I get them home and kick myself because they don't look or fit the way I thought they would. Money saved is now money lost. Same goes with what she said about deals. Less isn't always more. Sometimes you're just getting what you pay for. Bottom line, I'm a sucker for a good deal. But buying a new pair of jeans at 30% off isn't the same as signing your rights away. The next time you're offered a deal, read the fine print. Know what you're getting yourself into. The world of wrongful convictions is a living hell for individuals who end up in it. And believe it or not, it could happen to almost anyone. Know the law, know how to look for flaws in the system, understand how marginalization works, and most of all, talk about it. Thanks for listening. I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Loso.
All of us could falsely confess to something.
They blew it all out of proportion, and they got away with it.
Even a country like Canada has people who are charged and convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
There's innocent people who are going to die in prison.
I can't get back the time that they took from me.
And I was just left wondering, like, what the hell is happening?
I knew my life was over right there. That's when my life ended.
They're changing the story that I told them to match to what really happened.
I was just incarcerated for 37 years for somebody else's crime.
That what happened to me could easily happen to anybody.
Real Life Wrongs is produced by Kelly Fanson, edited by Alex Glutch, promotional materials by Jamie Norrie.